The story of the American colonies is often told through tales of courage, discovery, and the struggle for freedom. But long before revolutions and declarations, there was survival. For the earliest settlers who crossed the Atlantic in the 1600s, the greatest enemy was not muskets or rival nations. It was winter. Imagine stepping off a wooden ship after months at sea. You've left behind everything you knew in England or Europe: the cobblestone streets, the bustling markets, the safety of familiar farms. Before you stretches a vast, unfamiliar wilderness. The trees tower above you, thicker and denser than anything you've seen. The air feels sharp, colder than you expected, and you soon learn that the winter here will not be like winters back home. It will be harsher, longer, and deadlier. The colonists who settled in Virginia, Massachusetts, and other parts of North America quickly discovered that they had stepped into a land of extremes. Summers could be humid and sweltering, filled with mosquitoes and diseases like malaria. But winters, those tested everything. The cold crept through thin walls, rivers froze, food supplies dwindled, and illness struck with no mercy. For many of the first colonists, the dream of building a new life across the ocean nearly ended in those first winters. Entire communities starved, and death rates soared. Yet against the odds, some survived. They learned, adapted, borrowed knowledge from Native Americans, and slowly carved out ways to endure the bitter season. This script will take you deep into that world. We'll explore how colonists prepared for winter, how they kept warm, how they stored food, what they ate, and even how their faith carried them through when all seemed lost. From the wooden cabins of New England to the tobacco fields of Virginia, we'll step back into the 1600s and witness the daily battle for survival when snow blanketed the colonies. By the end, you'll see winter not just as a season of hardship, but as a defining crucible, shaping the resilience, resourcefulness, and character of the people who would one day build a nation. This is the story of how colonists survived harsh winters in the 1600s. When the first colonists arrived in the early 1600s, they were not fully prepared for the severity of American winters. Many assumed the climate would be similar to England's, but what they found was something far more brutal. Jamestown, Virginia. The English settlers who landed at Jamestown faced their first winter with little preparation. They had come in search of gold and profit, not to build farms or stockpile food. The settlement was built on swampy land, which made farming difficult. Disease spread quickly, and the hot summers weakened many settlers before the cold even arrived. By the winter of 1609 to 1610, conditions were catastrophic. This period became known as the starving time. Supplies had run out, and native tribes, once trading partners, refused to help the desperate colonists. As the cold set in, the settlers ate anything they could find: rats, snakes, leather, and even their horses. Historical accounts suggest that some even resorted to cannibalism. Of the 500 colonists in Jamestown at the start of winter, only about 60 survived until spring. For the survivors, the lesson was unforgettable. Without preparation, winter could wipe out an entire colony. Plymouth Colony, 1620. Further north, the Pilgrims who landed in Plymouth in 1620 experienced a winter equally deadly. After a grueling voyage on the Mayflower, the settlers were weakened by months at sea. They arrived late in the season, too late to plant crops or build proper homes. Their first shelters were makeshift huts, with thin walls and poor insulation against the freezing winds off the Atlantic. That first winter, disease struck hard. Pneumonia, scurvy, and malnutrition spread rapidly. Families buried their dead in secret at night, fearful that native tribes might see their weakness. By the time spring arrived, nearly half of the 102 Pilgrims were dead. Yet unlike Jamestown, the Plymouth settlers found help. The Wampanoag people taught them essential survival techniques: planting corn with fish as fertilizer, hunting local game, and identifying edible plants. These lessons would become the foundation for their survival in future winters. Other New England settlements, as more colonists arrived through the 1600s, they too faced brutal winters. New England's climate was colder than anything most Europeans had ever experienced. Rivers froze solid, snow piled high, and storms could last for days. Settlements like Massachusetts Bay Colony recorded losses every winter, especially in the early years. But slowly, word spread across the Atlantic. Letters sent back to England warned new settlers of the hardships. Bring warm clothing, stockpile food, and prepare to work hard if you want to survive. Those who listened stood a better chance of making it through the season. The harsh lesson: These first encounters with winter taught the colonists that survival was not just about courage. It was about preparation, adaptation, and sometimes sheer luck. They learned to respect the land, to store food, to build stronger shelters, and to rely on one another. Without these hard lessons, the colonies might never have survived long enough to grow. The story of Jamestown's starving time and Plymouth's deadly winter set the tone for the rest of the century. Winter was always coming, and the colonists had to be ready. If there was one thing the colonists learned quickly, it was that survival in the New World depended on shelter. Without strong housing, a family could freeze to death before spring. In the 1600s, shelter wasn't just about comfort, it was the thin line between life and death. Early struggles, makeshift shelters. In the earliest years, many settlers arrived too late in the season to build proper homes. At Jamestown, colonists first lived in rough huts, dugouts, and lean-tos, temporary shelters made of branches, mud, and thatch. These were barely adequate against Virginia's damp winters. In Plymouth, the Pilgrims endured their first winter in cramped shelters or even aboard the Mayflower, enduring freezing winds that swept through the ship's rotting timbers. These early structures had little insulation, fires produced smoke but little warmth, and walls often let in icy drafts. Many colonists died simply because they had no real protection from the elements. Log cabins and timber homes. As settlements grew, colonists learned from both necessity and from observing Native American structures. By the mid-1600s, log cabins became the backbone of colonial housing, especially in colder regions. Colonists felled massive trees and notched them together to create sturdy walls. Between the logs, they stuffed clay, mud, straw, or moss called chinking to keep the cold winds out. Roofs were often thatched with straw or later shingled with wood. Inside, the cabins were simple but functional. A single large room with a stone fireplace for cooking and heat. Families often all slept in the same space to share warmth. Beds were made of straw or feathers, covered in wool blankets or animal skins. In New England, houses were sometimes framed with timber in the English style, with wattle and daub walls, woven sticks plastered with mud. These homes were sturdier but required more resources and time to build. Fireplaces and chimneys. One of the most important features of colonial housing was the fireplace. These massive stone hearths were the heart of the home, used for cooking, baking, drying clothes, and keeping the family alive through long nights. Chimneys were built wide so that fires could burn constantly. A good stockpile of wood was as valuable as food, since without fire, homes would quickly become unlivable. Colonists often built summer kitchens outdoors to prevent overheating in warm months, but in winter everything revolved around the fireplace. Children, elders, and the sick spent much of their time near its warmth. Improvements over time. As the decades passed, wealthier colonists built larger houses with multiple rooms, glass windows, and stronger insulation. But for most settlers in the 1600s, homes remained simple log cabins or small timber houses. Even so, compared to the flimsy huts of the first years, these shelters represented a massive improvement. Some colonists even built cellars or storage pits beneath their homes to keep food supplies from freezing. Animal pens were often built close to the house so livestock could be tended without venturing far into the snow. The symbol of survival. A sturdy cabin was more than just shelter. It was a statement. It meant a family had cut the trees, gathered the clay, and survived long enough to build something lasting. For a settler in the 1600s, finishing a cabin before the first frost was a matter of pride and relief. It meant the family had a fighting chance. Shelter was the foundation of survival. Without it, the colonists would have remained wanderers, vulnerable to the elements. With it, they could plant roots, endure the winters, and begin building communities that lasted. Section 4. Food preservation and storage. If building a cabin was the first step to surviving the winter, the second was making sure the family had enough food to last until spring. Winter was long, and once the ground froze, farming stopped completely. Without careful planning, entire communities faced hunger and starvation. Drying and smoking. One of the oldest methods the colonists used to preserve food was drying. Corn, beans, herbs, and berries could be laid out in the sun or near a warm fire until all moisture was gone. Once dried, these foods lasted for months without spoiling. For meat, colonists turned to smoking. They built smokehouses, small wooden structures where fires burned slowly, producing smoke that cured the meat. Venison, pork, and fish were hung from beams until they absorbed the smoke and dried out. This gave the food a salty, smoky flavor, but more importantly, kept it edible through the cold months. Salting and brining salt was a precious commodity in the 1600s, but it was essential for survival. Colonists packed fish and meat in barrels of salt, which drew out moisture and prevented rot. Sometimes they used brine, a salty solution that preserved food even longer. In coastal settlements, fishing was vital. Cod and herring were salted in huge quantities and shipped in barrels, becoming a staple for many colonial diets. Inland, salt was harder to come by, making it one of the most valuable trade items of the time. Root cellars and storage pits. Fresh crops like turnips, carrots, and potatoes were stored in root cellars or dugout pits lined with straw and leaves. These underground spaces stayed cool but not frozen, keeping food fresh for weeks or even months. Colonists often built them beneath their cabins or just outside, covering them with heavy wooden lids or stone. Grain storage was equally important. Corn, wheat, and oats were kept in wooden barrels or sacks, often hoisted up on platforms to keep out rats and moisture. A single bad harvest or spoiled storehouse could mean disaster for the entire community. Pickling and brewing. Pickling was another useful method. Colonists pickled vegetables in vinegar brine, making them last well into winter. Not only did this preserve the food, but it also provided vital nutrients that helped prevent scurvy. Brewing beer and cider was another form of preservation. Fresh water sources sometimes froze or became contaminated, but fermented drinks remained safe to consume. Colonists brewed apple cider, beer, and even weak small beer for children, which provided both hydration and calories. Community food stores. In many settlements, food preservation wasn't just a household task. It was a community effort. Families sometimes pooled resources, shared smokehouses, or stored grain collectively. Churches and town leaders often oversaw emergency reserves. Still, supplies were never guaranteed. Harsh winters tested these systems, and when food ran low, tensions rose. Some records speak of theft, disputes, and even violent clashes over dwindling supplies. The difference between life and death. The colonists quickly learned that food preservation wasn't optional, it was survival itself. Those who prepared in autumn, who salted their meat, dried their corn, and stored their roots carefully, often lived. Those who didn't, or who suffered crop failures, faced hunger, disease, and death. It was said that every family counted their barrels in the fall, like a banker counts coins. A single missing barrel could mean weeks of hunger. Food was wealth, power, and the very foundation of survival. By the end of the 1600s, colonists had refined their preservation methods, blending European traditions with Native American knowledge. These practices not only got them through harsh winters, but also shaped the very cuisine of early America. Section 5. Hunting and gathering in winter. Once the snow fell and the ground hardened, farming stopped. Fields that had produced corn, beans, and wheat were now frozen under layers of ice. Colonists had to turn to other ways of finding food, through hunting, trapping, fishing, and gathering anything edible the wilderness could provide. For many, this meant venturing into the cold forest daily, braving dangers for survival. Hunting game in harsh conditions. Hunting became a lifeline in winter. Deer, especially white-tailed deer, were the most sought-after prize. Their meat provided fresh food, while hides were turned into warm clothing. Colonists also hunted wild turkeys, rabbits, squirrels, and the occasional bear. But hunting in winter was no easy task. Snow made tracking animals possible, but also slowed hunters down. Muskets often misfired in damp weather, and the cold made long hunting trips exhausting. Still, a single successful hunt could feed a family for weeks. Some settlers set out in groups, both for safety and to increase chances of success. These hunting trips became almost ritual-like in winter, a balance between survival and danger. Trapping and small game. When large hunts failed, colonists relied on traps and snares to catch smaller animals. Wooden deadfalls, simple snares made from rope or vines, and pits were used to catch rabbits, birds, or even foxes. Trapping required patience and knowledge of animal behavior. Colonists learned much of this from Native Americans, who had perfected winter trapping over generations. Furs from trapped animals not only added to food supply but were also traded and used for clothing. Fishing beneath the ice. In areas with rivers and lakes, fishing continued even in winter. Colonists sometimes cut holes through ice and used nets or spears to catch fish like trout and perch. Smokehouses nearby preserved the catch for future meals. This was dangerous work. The ice could crack, and icy waters could kill in minutes. but fish was a valuable addition to a diet otherwise heavy with dried grain and salted meat. Gathering wild foods. Even in winter, the forest offered some resources. Colonists collected nuts stored by squirrels, dug for roots beneath the snow, and foraged for berries that sometimes lingered into early frost. They also gathered tree bark for medicinal teas and even ate it in desperate times. Pine needles, when boiled, provided a source of vitamin C, helping prevent scurvy. Mushrooms, dried in the fall, could be rehydrated for stews. Though gathering provided only small amounts, it was sometimes the difference between starvation and survival. Native American-influenced colonists would have struggled far more without knowledge gained from Native Americans. Indigenous tribes taught them how to track animals, identify edible plants, and prepare wild game properly. Techniques like using snowshoes to move faster or storing dried fish in pemmican, a high-energy mix of dried meat and fat, came directly from native survival practices. Many colonists admitted that, without this guidance, they would have perished. Winter survival was not just about tools, but about knowledge of the land. Dangers of winter. Hunting. While hunting and gathering were vital, they also brought risks. Colonists could become lost in blizzards, suffer frostbite, or be attacked by wolves. There were also tensions with native tribes over hunting territories. A hunter could return with food or never return at all. Yet despite the dangers, winter hunting and gathering remained essential. It gave colonists access to fresh food, something preserved stores alone could not provide. The lifeline of fresh food. When barrels of salted pork ran low and grain supplies thinned, a fresh rabbit or deer was like gold. Families feasted for a night, then carefully dried or smoked what remained. Children learned to trap birds, women gathered roots, and men risked the forest in hopes of finding game. Hunting and gathering in winter was never easy, but it kept the colonies alive. It was a daily reminder that survival in the New World meant constant work, constant vigilance, and an unbreakable will to endure. Section 6. Clothing and materials. If food and shelter were vital for survival, clothing was the shield that protected colonists every time they stepped into the freezing wind. In the 1600s, there were no synthetic fabrics, no insulated boots, and no modern coats. Colonists relied entirely on natural materials, wool, leather, and fur, to guard themselves against bitter winters. Wool, the backbone of colonial clothing. Wool was the most common and reliable fabric in the colonies. It was warm, thick, and held heat even when damp. Colonists brought woolen garments from Europe and quickly began spinning their own from sheep they raised. Men wore woolen doublets, cloaks, and breeches, while women wore wool gowns, petticoats, and shawls. Children were often wrapped in layered wool blankets. Colonists layered heavily, sometimes wearing 3 or 4 garments at once to block the wind. Knitted wool stockings and mittens were treasured, since fingers and toes were the first to freeze. Fur and animal skins. Wool alone was not enough, especially in the harsh New England winters. Colonists turned to animal furs for additional warmth. Deerskin, bear hides, rabbit fur, and especially beaver pelts became highly valued. Cloaks lined with fur or hats made from beaver pelts kept settlers alive in the coldest nights. Fur mittens and moccasins provided insulation far superior to leather boots. Colonists often traded with Native Americans for these furs, since indigenous people had long mastered their use in winter clothing. Leather and homemade materials. Leather was another critical material. Shoes, belts, and coats were crafted from cowhide or deerskin. In desperate times, colonists patched clothing with whatever scraps they had, sometimes even reusing old blankets to make coats. Women spun flax into linen for lighter undergarments, but linen was poor against the cold. Only when paired with wool and fur did it provide real protection. Layering for survival. Colonial fashion in winter was not about style, it was about layers. A man might wear a linen shirt, a wool doublet, a leather jerkin, and finally a thick wool cloak. A woman might wear multiple petticoats, a bodice, a shawl, and a heavy wool gown. Children were wrapped in cloaks and animal hides, sometimes barely able to move under all the layers. The wealthiest colonists could afford imported fabrics like heavy broadcloth or silk-lined garments. But for most, clothing was patched, rough, and purely practical. Clothing as status and survival. Even though survival was the goal, clothing still reflected status. A wealthy merchant in Boston might wear fine woolens dyed in deep colors, while a farmer in the backcountry wore rough, undyed homespun. But in winter, even the wealthiest learned that practicality mattered more than fashion. Silk could not keep out the cold, but wool and fur could. For colonists, clothing wasn't just a way to show who they were. It was the armor that stood between them and frostbite, sickness, or death. The final layer: community and resilience. In many households, clothing was handmade. Mothers spun wool and flax, daughters sewed garments, and fathers hunted animals for skins. Clothing was a family effort, just like shelter and food storage. And every winter, colonists thanked the layers on their backs. Without them, even the simplest chore, fetching water, gathering wood, or checking traps, would have been impossible. Clothing was survival, stitched by hand and strengthened by determination. The colonists faced bitter winters with nothing but wool, fur, and their own determination. Shelter, food, and clothing gave them a fighting chance, but their struggle was far from over. In the next part, we'll uncover how they battled sickness, leaned on faith, and endured tragedies that tested the limits of human survival. So if you enjoyed this journey back to the 1600s, make sure to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for part 2. The story of survival is only half told.